but the grand jury was not allowed to do what it wanted.
I know that because you could not repeat in the report much of the testimony that you heard and evidence that you received, that you are somewhat frustrated by it, and that's understandable.
In the final analysis, I know that the grand jury hated at this point to give it up, because I think the public needs to know about the seriousness of the drug problem here in Saline County and maybe other surrounding counties.
It was now 2.5 years since the incident of the boys on the tracks. Saline County Deputy Prosecutor Gene Duffy was asked to head up the newly created Drug Task Force. The job would require her to investigate drug trafficking in a 3-county area of Arkansas, including Saline County. However, on the day she was appointed, her boss, Prosecutor Gary Arnold, gave her a peculiar command.
Gary Arnold came into my office, stood in front of my desk, looked me straight in the face and said, "Jean, you are not to use the Drug Task Force to investigate any public official." He turned on his heel and marched out. Now, as startling as that statement might sound, I really didn't think that it was going to pose any kind of problem, because at that time I didn't have any indication that there was any public official in our judicial district who was involved in drugs.
Almost immediately, Jean's undercover team discovered that a number of public officials in her district were indeed involved in drug trafficking. Gary Arnold's directive had now become a dilemma. Jean couldn't include the information in her reports because Arnold would know she was disobeying orders. Also, in case Arnold himself was involved in the corruption, she didn't want him to have access to this information. There was, however, a solution.
I knew at the time that there had been a federal investigation going on for about 9 months into the public official corruption in Saline County, which was being headed by Assistant U.S. Attorney Bob Govar. So Govar seemed to be the likely person to take this information to, which I did, and he was appreciative because it supported the information that he had already been gathering, plus added to and gave him new information to broaden his investigation.
Bob Govar had been assigned by U.S. Attorney Chuck Banks to head the Federal Organized Crime and Drug Enforcement Task Force. Govar had already developed substantial information linking public officials to drug activities by the time Gene Duffy's task force was operational. In July of 1990, one of Gene Duffy's undercover officers developed evidence linking the train deaths to public officials and drugs. 3 years had passed since the boys had been killed, and Jean had no way of knowing that her drug task force was about to be shut down for nearly solving Kevin and Don's murders.
It didn't occur to me that it was appropriate for our drug task force to reopen the case of the boys on the track until one of my undercover officers came to me and told me that not only was the case drug-related, but it was also solvable. He asked permission to investigate, and I agreed to that and told him that we would take our information then to Bob Govar.
Ironically, Dan Harmon and Richard Garrett, the very same men who had conducted the grand jury investigation of Kevin and Don's murders, were two of the main targets of Govar's drug and corruption investigation. Linda Ives, who for years had believed Harmon and Garrett were sincerely trying to solve her son's murder, now realized they were the ones orchestrating the cover-up.
We certainly don't have any suspects at this point in time. It's been quite a while, and I really didn't anticipate that it would take this long when we first started. I'm frustrated in the amount of time that it's taken. Frustrated that we weren't able to accomplish some things that we probably should have been able to. Whatever comes out of it, if someone's charged or not charged, the grand jury has done a tremendous job.
But it still will leave the open question, if the boys were murdered, who did it?
Well, until it's solved, that's correct.
To make matters worse, Harmon suddenly became the prosecutor-elect for a 3-county district, which included Saline County. Harmon, who had friends in the Arkansas press, wasted no time in launching a massive media smear campaign against Gene Duffy.
He immediately began a media crusade against me. First of all, using the Benton Courier and Linda Hollenbeck as the reporter, and he also used the Arkansas Democrat and Doug Thompson as the reporter. And for some reason, these two people would write anything that he said to them. They didn't care anything about substantiating anything he said. They just reported it. In the next 5 months, there were over 200 newspaper articles crucifying my reputation. Not one thing that they alleged was truthful. They had me stealing federal funds. They had me making illegal arrests. Every allegation that might destroy my credibility was made. I could have played the same game Harmon was playing and reported to the media the information that I had about him, and truth would have been on my side. But this would have jeopardized the federal investigation. And I wasn't so concerned about public opinion of me because I felt like in the end all the truth was going to come out, because at this point I still had faith in the judicial system.
Harmon was pounding Jean from every angle. He influenced the filing of a $1.2 million lawsuit against Jean. He facilitated the sabotage of task force records through a fiscal officer who was reporting to Harmon. And he was threatening task force informants whose names had been given to him by a task force agent Jean had fired. By September of 1990, Harmon's smear campaign had reached a critical point, and Jean knew that unless Harmon was indicted, her days as head of the task force were numbered. Govar repeatedly assured Jean that indictments against Harmon and others were imminent, but they did not come in time to save Jean's job. According to Govar, his boss, U.S. Attorney Chuck Banks, was the holdup.
The members of my board of directors had warned me for several weeks that they were not going to be able to continue to support me in the face of all of the bad publicity. And in fact, when they did fire me finally in November, it was not because of anything that I had done wrong, but because I had become, in their opinion, ineffective because of all of the bad press. I had 7 undercover officers working for me. They were family men who needed jobs. 5 of them resigned in protest to my firing.
Although no longer head of the task force, Jean and the task force officer who had been investigating the train deaths continued to gather evidence. In December of 1990, Jean and her officer went to U.S. Attorney Chuck Banks with their case. This signaled the beginning of the end of the federal investigation. Although Banks promised Jean and her officer they could testify before the grand jury, that never happened. However, several witnesses developed by Jean's task force did testify. One of them was Charlene Wilson, a former girlfriend of both Dan Harmon and convicted drug felon Roger Clinton, Governor Clinton's brother.
Charlene was recommended to our task force as an informant from DEA, who had used her as an informant, and also from at least 2 other law enforcement agencies that had used her as an informant and said that she was reliable. I used Charlene, and she proved to be very, very reliable. There was not one bit of information that she ever gave me that didn't pan out.
Dan always had cocaine on him, always. Robert Govar and Chuck Banks were the U.S. attorneys for the District of Arkansas at that time. I was subpoenaed to testify on behalf of the drug trafficking and the cartel, more or less is what it was, that had to do with Dan Harmon. I was asked quite in